A very warm welcome to the third of our 4 online workshops entitled Global Black Women's Writing, Experimental Subjectivities. I am Pelagia Goulimari, academic co-lead of the Intersectional Humanities Research Program at the Oxford Research Center in the Humanities, Torch. Our workshops pose a guiding question. In what inventive ways do Black women writers from Britain, the Caribbean, Africa, the US experiment with the representation of Black subjectivity? The workshops suggest an answer. Black women writers reshape the formal structure of their texts and pioneer different styles of narration in their efforts to depict the lives, histories, and subjective realities of racialized subjects. The revolutionary content and stylistic innovations deployed by Black women writers enable readers to confront and even change their fixed ideas about racialized subjects. 4 wonderful speakers, 3 of them today, will be presenting. Presentations will last about 14 minutes, followed by discussion. Please type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Workshops are convened by Sheldon George, Jean Wyatt, and myself. Presentations are revised towards an edited collection edited by Sheldon and Jean, which is forthcoming from Bloomsbury for the Global Women Writing series. Thank you very much for contributing to the process of revision through your questions. Many thanks also to Intersectional Humanities at Torch, and many thanks to Sheldon and Jean for moderating the discussion. Over to you, Sheldon.
Jean, right?
Jean, over to you, Jean.
Thanks. So Jennifer Gustar is our first speaker. She's Associate Professor of English and Cultural Studies at the University of British Columbia in Kelowna. Recently, she co-edited Ladies and Laughter as Feminist Aesthetic. She has written articles on women writers in the UK and in the South Asian diaspora. She is currently working on a study of the intersections of race and gender in contemporary British women's historical fiction. Dr. Gustar is also co-editor of the Bloomsbury series in Global Women's Writing. Jennifer?
Thank you, Jean. Thank you very much.
Let me just say that the title of her talk is Welcoming Familiars, Bernardine Evaristo's Fiction and Black Women's Time.
Thanks, Jean, and thank you also to Sheldon and Pelagia, and I'm just going to head right in to be on time. So Sarah Ahmed's work speaks to the ways in which members of diaspora are too often only ever recognized as out of place. Quote, strangers are those who are in their very proximity already recognized as not belonging, as being out of place. Bernardine Evaristo's writing disturbs this spatial demarcation. While I have benefited from the securing in place of a privileged whiteness that is undeserved and that has eclipsed, demeaned, and often destroyed those who are subjugated to its reviling of difference, Evaristo has been unwilling to abide by a destiny created for her elsewhere. My future was not propitious, she writes in Manifesto. However, her life's work to date has proven that she would upend this temporality by refusing the narrative that Black Britons are strangers who should know their place. Evaristo's experiments with history and memory challenge official white narratives and accommodate a host of Black subjects, thus producing shared collective memory by means of a self-conscious and original aesthetic that confronts the occlusions of history by returning familiar figures of memory and post-memory. Her very first novel, Lara, is the first work to introduce stylistic choices that set much of her fiction apart. The hybrid nature of the novel in verse, the focalizations of a range of characters, and a non-chronological structure that is nonetheless genealogical. Instead, the novel links events as they might emerge in memory, divesting linearity of its teleological tyranny, inviting us to identify divergent, intersecting histories as haunting the present. What underlies this web of connection between distant times and diverse spaces might best be explained by Marianne Hirsch's concept of post-memory, and I quote, "A space of remembrance, more broadly available through cultural and public, and not merely individual and personal acts of remembrance, identification, and projection. It is a question of adopting the traumatic experiences and thus also the memories of others as one's own, or as experiences one might oneself have had, and of inscribing them into one's own life story. Evaristo's first novel is indeed a text that adopts the memories of others to tell a story of the self, creating a repository of memory upon which Lara builds her identity. Lara is acutely aware of her father's emotional distance and his refusal to share his ancestral past. He was born in Nigeria and, quote, "the cultural memory of Africa might be said to be only one generation away from Lara's upbringing in Britain." In Lara's childhood garden, she, quote, "summons the daddy people to appear, phantoms perched in trees like owls, smiling, singing." This refusal of temporal and spatial boundaries is significant as these familiars from a different time and place return as uncanny post-memories. As Hirsch remarks, post-memory is not identical to memory. It is post, but at the same time, it approximates memory in its affective force and its psychic effects. These post-memories then are a profound part of diasporic space. Quote, "journeying in," as Evaristo puts it, they inform the imagination and psyche of Lara. We eventually learn that underpinning these connections between times and places is an old and traumatic story. The acknowledged foundation of British wealth, white supremacy, and the development of race slavery, Bunce Island in Sierra Leone, and the triangular trade. The novel opens with the memory poem of Severina, who is raped on Bunce Island by a British guard and later enslaved in Brazil. Severina, like the daddy people, journeys in from Brazil in 1849, recrossing the Middle Passage as a spectral figure, recounting her journey from Nigeria to Brazil and rerouting through her offspring to her great-granddaughter, Lara, in London of 1900s. Lara's story then is a story of post-memories, but also very much a British story in that it is the story of migration. And it parallels other stories of British origins, such as those of Imperial Rome and the foundation of Londinium, a theme Evaristo revisits in her second novel, The Emperor's Babe. Evaristo's project in The Emperor's Babe is made explicit through her epigraph from Oscar Wilde. "The one duty we owe to history is to rewrite it." The central character, Zulika, is a spunky 16-year-old and child of Sudanese diaspora, living in Londinium in the 3rd century Common Era. At the age of 11, she is married off by her merchant father to an elderly Roman governor, Felix. She aspires to the status only a relationship to patriarchal power can bestow. She wants to see herself, quote, "sprawled all over the Daily Looking Glass," an anachronistic reference to Britain's pulp publication, the Daily Mirror. And in keeping with the temporal and spatial irregularities performed throughout the novel, language contemporaneous to the time of writing serves continuously to dislocate the reader in time and space between Roman Londinium and contemporary London. We know that the time is 211 because Zulika at 16 is involved in an extramarital love affair with Severus Septimus, who was the first African emperor of the Romans from 193 to 211 CE. On one of her first outings with the emperor, she is sickened by the excesses of empire. She is transported like a trophy on the Thames to a Roman amphitheater, where Severus is being celebrated by means of a grotesque spectacle that includes a sacrifice of slaves in the Roman blood sport known as bestiari, damnation to beasts. Zuleika witnesses the following spectacle of violence against pregnant Pictish women. Quote, 5 naked women were led out of a trap door, chained at the wrists and ankles. All were heavy with child. Each woman was pushed into a cage. I tried to put my eyes out of focus, to witness and yet not, as what had been human became chunks for the butcher's block, red, raw tenderloin. Here we are also witness to the brutal excesses against those whose gender and ethnicity marked them as out of place, less than human, thus revealing that which is firmly in place, misogynistic and ethnocentric patriarchal power. Zuleika here encounters something familiar but long forgotten. At any moment, at a man's whim, she herself can be turned into raw tenderloin. Evaristo thus equates the status of women with that of the slaves, convicts, Christians, prisoners of war, and the poor, fated to die for the pleasure of the imperial center. Her anachronistic layering of time and place evokes this post-memory by raising these specters of historical trauma from the dead. These scenes of enslaved women consumed by lions bring to mind the horrors of imperial Rome, certainly, but also implicitly reference another empire with its own history of imperious brutality towards and enslavement of others. Since Roman times, the personification of Britain, Britannia, has been depicted wearing a Roman helmet with the lion as her closest companion. Like Lara, Girl, Woman, Other is polyphonic, which allows our engagement with a broad range of Black women's subjectivities and memories. Evaristo moves freely through temporal and spatial zones, affecting a sense of the enduring interconnectedness of the characters. This novel is concerned with the way the contemporary is an amalgam of the autobiographical memories of 12 Black and British narrators whose stories intersect over time and place. I will focus on one telling interrelation to particularly revealing autobiographies. Penelope, at 14, considers herself destined for great things, but as a teen, she bemoans her parentage as far beneath her and her aspirations. She eventually learns that these, quote, dull and dispassionate automatons are not her biological parents, and we learn of her deep internal contradictions as she seeks to fill the gaping, aching chasm she now carried inside her. The feeling of being unmoored, unwanted, unloved, undone, a no one. She is, in her most self-pitying voice, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. She has learned her ancestry is 13% African. Something new emerges as she travels north to meet her mother, Harriet. Her recognition that anyone can be a relative. Echoing Laura and the Emperor, oh, I'm sorry, I missed a section. Oh, there we go. 6, 7. Other side. Oh, no, okay. Echoing Laura and the Emperor's Babe, this novel too insists on the early origins of Black subjects in Britain and further emphasizes Evaristo's pervasive focus on relationality, both genealogical and affective. When the two meet, Black women's time takes hold as the years are swiftly regressing until the lifetimes between them no longer exist. This is not about feeling something or about speaking words. This is about being together. This being, about being and in relation, is the core of the novel and represents another kind of return to time and place, prior to racialization, to the reification of difference, and to historical erasures, just being as constituted in relationality. Thus, Harriet and Penelope find their place. Like Lara and Zulika, they negate hegemonic white temporality and reorder space and time to reveal what has been eclipsed. This novel ends with a powerful celebration of relations, of being in relation, and of Black women's time. In her work, Evaristo allows for new and shared collective memories that counter the long history of erasure by positioning the memories and post-memories of Black British women and all their relations firmly in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I am Sheldon George, and I will introduce our next speaker, who is Tadiwa Madenga. She is a writer and a scholar of African and Black diasporic literature and culture. She's currently a PhD candidate in African and African American Studies and English at Harvard University, and she's a visiting scholar at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Tadiwa?
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Here we go. So first I want to start by saying thank you to the organizers for the invitation to talk to all of you guys about this exciting theme. And I'm particularly thrilled to be talking about Melissa Miambo because she's a writer that's not often invoked in these kinds of discussions around experimental writing, but her work has been really central and influential to my own thinking about this theme. So my talk today is titled Indigenous Pageantry, Shadows, Subjectivities in Melissa Miambo's Jacaranda Journals. So Melissa Miambo is a Zimbabwean writer and scholar. She currently lectures at Wits University in South Africa and is known for her short stories, most notably, and excuse my French, the story La Salle de Pâte, which was shortlisted for the 2012 Kane Prize. Today, however, I want to talk about Miambo's lesser-known collection of short stories or fictional experiments called Jacaranda Journals. I say lesser known because the book is currently out of print and unfortunately difficult to circulate. So though the book was originally published in 2001, I'll be discussing it within the context of the year it was written in 1995, which was also an integral year for debates around homosexuality in Zimbabwe. So my talk will try to situate Miambo's work as part of really important emerging literature that was happening in the mid-1990s, where Zimbabwean writers were playing with queer subjectivities in their work. So I became interested in Miambo as I was working on my current dissertation, which focuses on the 1995 Zimbabwe International Book Fair. And that particular book fair was a political turning point in the country because of the controversial banning of the Gay and Lesbian Association from participating. The fair was also the first public confrontation between then President Robert Mugabe and the queer community. And I'll return to the book fair a bit later on in my talk. So a couple of reasons Jacaranda Journals is a crucial text to think about this moment is that first, it's the only book that I really found that looks at the 1990s and tries to depict a queer community rather than isolated, closeted individual characters. It's also not only a direct response to Mugabe's rhetoric at that time, but it was a text generated from the site of the book fair itself. The book is also written in these really interesting, fragmented yet intersecting narratives. Some of them take the form of short stories, some are plays, some of these like fictional letters to fictional editors, newspapers and editors. So when I interviewed Miambo a few years ago about the process of writing this eclectic book, she told me that she had written the text in about 3 to 4 months in, quote, an almost manic kind of state of mind. and talking about how her mixed race background and her sense of being adjacent to, but also an outsider to many communities in Hara shapes the work. She said, "That was an experiment for me to write that book. What struck me about the different types of people I would interact with was the way they didn't interact with each other, even though, you know, Zim is very tiny. One thing that was very unique about my experiences in Zim is that I traveled in lots of different communities, whether it was the colored community, the Indian community, various types of middle class or working class communities, but I'm a stranger." So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to break it down into 3 brief sections that I hope I'll get through. I'll first contextualize the politics of the book fair through the lens of indigenization, which is a word that reoccurs in Nyambo's text. And then I'll talk a bit about Nyambo's stylistic response to the book fair as a form of shade. And then I'll end with some readings from Jacaranda journals, particularly the short story Indigenous Transactions. So the discourse around indigenization in Zimbabwean politics usually refers to legal processes around Black economic empowerment, nationalization, and land redistribution. And these debates reached a peak in the early 2000s under Mugabe's regime. I won't go into too much detail on that today. Instead, I'm thinking about indigenization more loosely as a form of political storytelling that was taking shape in various iterations in the 1990s. And in particular, the 2 major ways that indigenization appears in discourses of the book fair, particularly around homosexuality. So the first major political storytelling that came from the 1995 book fair was the letter justifying the banning of the Gay and Lesbian Association that was written by the Director of Information at that time, Bonwell Chakawadze. And he wrote that while the government acknowledged culture as a dynamic concept, Zimbabwean society was not accepting of homosexuality. So he didn't frame it necessarily in legal terms, but he framed it as a kind of cultural issue. And then the second more infamous iteration of political storytelling was, of course, from then President Mugabe's keynote speech at the book fair, where he described gay people as sexual perverts. And this speech and others that he gave in 1995 against homosexuality have often been synthesized and sensationalized by regional and global media under the slogan, "Homosexuality isn't African." And so in my dissertation and in this particular chapter, I think about this heteronormative indigenization that was happening through political forms of storytelling. And I ask how writers who were at the book fair itself engaged these narratives and kind of formed their own modes of counter storytelling. So perhaps another way to ask this question is, how does one respond to an insult? And an answer that I've been exploring is reading Nyambo's storytelling as shade. Many of you will be familiar with shade, especially if you participate in social media. And I'll be using kind of shade, reading, or dragging people synonymously. And the idea of shade originates in Black queer, and drag pageant subcultures in the United States. And more recently, the notion of critical shade has also entered academia through the rise of Black queer studies and scholars like E. Patrick Johnson and Tavia Nyong'o. So since I don't have time to go through the many forms of shade, I'll just offer 3 entry points that I'm still working out, but I'm excited by. And the first is, of course, the classic one from Dorian Corey, which describes reading or shade as the art form of insult. And I love this example from Nyambo, who, when I was talking to her about her love-hate relationship with book fairs, she just simply said, of course I like books, but not the people that write them. That would be a quick example of shade. And then another characteristic I've been thinking about is shade as shadow, which I take from Namwali Sapel's Notes on Shade, where she writes, shade as in shadow, shade as in what is cast by and also surrounded by brightness, shade as the inverse of a spotlight, shade as the sketch artist. Technique is used to evoke penumbra and detail, to pull dimensionality out of a flatness, shade as in calibration, gradation, nuance, subtlety, shade as in ghost, haunt, spirit, spook, shade as in tint, tinge, tone, hue, or simply color. And then lastly, I'm thinking about shade as artful fabulation through Talia Nyong'o, who writes, fabulation in this sense is not so much imagination as it is imagination's shadow. The power in critical shade rests precisely in its active skill as a reader of social and cultural texts. Critical shade looks to the precise moment, occasion, or angle from which the gaze can be reflected back in a gesture of counter-mimesis. So, and more concrete example about how these complex characteristics around shade might appear in Jacaranda journals comes most prominently in the short story Indigenous Transactions. The story takes place in one night at the Jacaranda drag pageant, which is actually a name of a drag pageant that used to happen in Hawaii in the 80s and 90s. And the story is told through the protagonist Boom Shaka, who at first has no idea what he's witnessing, but eventually gives into the scene and ends up partying all night. So it has very utopic sensibilities. But what I'm most interested in is the fact that the category for the pageant is Indigenous, meaning the contestants have to interpret this identity. And one example of how Nyambo writes about this is, she says, a plump Black woman is wearing a satin wedding dress, frothy with lace. A colored woman is glamorous in Black sequins, hair upswept in chignon. Finally, a tall Black lady with long legs is strutting across the stage in a tight-fitting violet silk evening dress. She's teetering on high purple stilettos and is wearing a platinum blonde wig. Boom Shaka catches her last words. I'd like to say thank you to Romeo for styling my hair. I was after a very Indigenous look. So first I want to point out that very obviously the contestants are interpreting indigeneity ironically. And in the story, the contestants dress up as these kind of major non-Zimbabwean divas like Naomi Campbell or Patti LaBelle. And so the kind of reading of Mugabe that I'm interested in is not one that tries to create like real representations of what would be Indigenous subjectivity, but these more shady or shadowy subjectivities that might play into Mugabe's narrative in order to stylistically subvert it. And I'm exploring kind of different variations of what that might look like in Nyambo's work. So just to keep time, I'll end with a few lines from a note at the end of Jacaranda journals that I think provides a fun and shady invitation from Nyambo to read her work within the theme of this seminar, so the theme of experimentation. And dear anybody, many words have two or more meanings. Most words have multiple meanings, and the meaning depends on how you string the words together and where you place your emphasis and inflection. But we shouldn't talk about parts of speech. Cherish or be wary of both, of violet, mauve, and purple. Press flowers between the pages of this book. Or is it a daily newspaper, or a diary, a letter, or a journal? No matter, scatter the petals to the wind. Yours truly. P.S. If you're bored reading this, then life must be a drag.
Thank you, Tadiwa. The next person I want to introduce is Rhonda Frederick, who is a professor of English and African diaspora studies at Boston College. She writes on Caribbean and African diaspora fiction and narratives of migration. She is the author most recently, in fact, in 2022, of Evidence of Things Not Seen, Fantastical Blackness in Genre Fiction. Rhonda?
Hi, thank you so much for the organizers and my co-panelists. I'm really grateful to be here. I just want to start by saying that this presentation includes discussions of rape, sexual abuse, incest, violence, and death. Just want to let everybody know. And I'm ready to go. I've pulled together 4 different perspectives for the critical frame that I use to interpret Nalo Hopkinson's Brown Girl in the Ring. I'm sorry, Nalo Hopkinson's Midnight Robber. Omasike Natasha Tinsley's ideas from Black Atlantic, Queer Atlantic. Regine Michelle Jean-Charles ideas from Toward a Victim Survivor Narrative. And histories of Trinidad carnival figures and definitions of science fiction and fantasy. And I pulled those 4 spaces or ideas together to in this way. Put in conversation, these 4 perspectives are my point of departure for imagining a past future self for Tantan in Nalo Hopkinson's Midnight Robber. Fantastical truths define Blackness in diaspora and are effectively expressed through the novel's form and use of the Midnight Robber, thus modeling imaginable possibilities for readers' extra-literary worlds. So that is the perspective from which I'm reading Nalo Hopkinson's Midnight Robber. So now hopefully you can see those perspectives in the way that I interpret the text. And here I go. Set on and between the Pan-Caribbean planets of Tucson and New Halfway Tree, featuring a nanotechnology that infiltrates all life, and imagining native beings and fantastical flora and fauna defined by Caribbean cultures, Midnight Robbers stimulates readers' imaginations by using science fiction most applicable features, that is, assessing the way things are, making the familiar dramatically unfamiliar, and exemplifying ways to imagine differently. Readers can empathize with Midnight Robber's protagonist as she lives in and through precarities, incest and rape, murder, interplanetary settler colonialism, forced involuntary migrations, and the exploitation of sentient beings. And yet, because the novel's formalist exaggerations insist that we see differently, readers approach the violences that characterize Tantan's young life and the choices she makes in spite of them from a critically imaginable perspective. This Tantan, contextualized in a science fiction fantasy novel and Trinidadian carnival traditions, and as part of Caribbean and other diasporas, is a victim survivor through which readers experience a differently imagined, nuanced subjectivity and can reflect on the process through which such a self comes to be. Hopkinson's novel ends dramatically with the protagonist, in true Midnight Robber style, regaling stepmother Janicet and revelers at Sweet Pone Carnival with the narrative of her life. Yet this stunning conclusion is practically outpaced by how Tantan claims the child she carries. Janicet demands to know the baby's paternity, suspecting Antonio, her partner, and the teenager's father, but unwilling to name him as his daughter's rapist. Tantan's response is well considered. Whose? She'd carried the monster all this way. The damn picnic was hers. Here, the physical act of carrying the monster defines the mother-child relationship. However, after delivering the baby, Tantan lay back, Bursuti with fatigue, and looked at the little bit of person in her arms. His eyes wavered over her body, fought for focus when they came to her face. For a second, he stared right at her. He had Antonio's face, but they were her features too. Hers. Her son was not a monster. In 7 pages, fetus transforms from monster to son, Tantan's embrace of presents her as a woman whose motherhood exists in excess of the traumas through which she has lived and from which the baby was conceived. The above scene draws attention to what pre-exists, exists in, survives, and enables the female hero evolving identity, her relationship to an aggregate of experiences that ultimately influence both the birth and herself. I am interested in how Tantan is with this aggregate. That is, I want to look closely at how she comes to know and be self, notwithstanding horrible experiences imagined in Midnight Robber. How the novel's hero makes her way through a life dramatically imagined in a sci-fi novel is key. She actively makes choices that put her on a path to becoming, a journey that reveals how readers can imagine making a past future self in excess of overlapping oppressions. Disabling biological differences and enabling sensory skills exist with truths of Tantan's Toussaint and Junjatown pasts. Unlike humans who understand Duin, which are the sentient beings on New Halfway Tree, as inferior beings, the hero almost immediately sees beyond physical differences and embraces Duin as peers. Nevertheless, the novel does not represent this openness uncritically. For example, Tantan viscerally rejects Duin foodways, but does not do so because of any sense of human superiority, but because of aversions to particular consistencies and textures developed after years of sexual abuse. This description demonstrates how much Tantan's self is composed of places in which she lives and has lived, what happens to her in these spaces, and how she has been in them. Anatomy prevents Tantan from speaking the nanny song-like language that Hinti speak, and Hinti are the female Duin. But in the time she spends with Abatifa, a Duin female, she learns to understand and speak a version of it. Completely immersed in a Duin way of life and growing into woman as Tifa grows into her adult Hinti self, the novel's hero appreciates what she learns while coveting strengths that are uniquely Duin. Tantan wants to have what Tifa has: size, physical strength, sonar, echolocation, and the ability to fly. She wants, in other words, the power to protect herself, always. Rage about what Antonio has done to her pushes Tantan towards physical exhaustion. She tries to share her feelings with Abatifa, but her human reality is one that the young Hinti cannot understand. He raped me, Abatifa. He put this baby in me like the other one before. He was forever trying to plant me like I was his soil to harvest. Abatifa scratched her 2 feet them on a little piece of ground. Why? How the wrath am I to know? Tell me how. I only wish I could have stopped he, kick he with my claw foot them, juk out his eye with my pointy beak. You are not Hinti, Abatifa pointed out. The sobs erupted, harsh as costs, not a Hinti, not nothing with value. Better that I dead. Tantan's human self intrudes on her life among Duin when she learns that she is pregnant. It is also significant that this intrusion gives rise to the female hero's desire to be Hinti, specifically to be a Hinti who uses her physicality to self-protect. But at this point, Tantan can only rely on humans' ability to get an abortion, so she ventures from Daddy Tree in search of a abortifacient, like the one she used for her first pregnancy. She can imagine more, however, as she moves between Daddy Tree and Chiggerbite Town, as Tantan, the Midnight Robber, becomes more real. Following Tantan, the Midnight Robber Queen tales from town to town, Janicet and crew eventually track the young human to Chiggerbite Town. Twice stepmother cites stepdaughter. The first time the pursuit is interrupted by the landscape. The car becomes tangled in the bush. Returning with a vehicle equipped to dominate New Halfway Tree's vegetation, Janicet tracks the protagonist to the Doohan's daddy tree. In this first Doohan-human confrontation on Doohan turf, Benta, which is Tifa's aunt, Benta's sister, Taya, who is Tifa's aunt, is murdered and Michael is wounded. The conflagration also marks Tantan's dishonoring of the pledge she makes to Chichibud. The girl's action leads human into Doohan's space. To navigate the threat that humans pose, all Daddy Tree families agree that they must destroy their home and move away to protect themselves from future human incursions, but without Tantan and Abatifa. Their actions force the two females out of Doohan community. As a family of two, Abatifa and Tantan struggle to make their way into the bush without the benefit of Doohan community, or because of the threat Janicet poses, with only intermittent incursions into human villages. For the protagonist, this is not only another exile, but also an alienation that immerses her into a new way to live on New Halfway Tree. Together, Human and Hinty learn an unprecedented degree of self-reliance. This lesson is particularly relevant for Tantan as she yearns for human contact, but becomes hyper-aware of human failings. She frequents human towns to trade things she and Tifa make for goods they cannot make. Thank you. The female hero also helps beings, human and local fauna, whenever she can, holding Chichibud's directive close. In these ways, Tifa and Tantan live in the shadow place between two peoples. It's my last paragraph. It is not a coincidence that Nalo Hopkinson explores incest, infidelity, and crimes of passion using the literary genre of science fiction. By using popular fiction to represent sexual violence against women, the author makes use of the genre's most socially relevant features, that of surveying the way things are and imagining things differently. The author defamiliarizes extra literary realities by depicting dimension-shifting time travel, nanotechnologies, and alien beings. Themes that drive other types of prose fiction also animate Midnight Robber, but its blended science fiction fantasy forms make the difficult to imagine or the unspeakable realities of sexual violence, physical violence, forced migrations, and alienations dramatically present. The exaggerated context into which Hopkinson writes these themes makes Tantan's choices equally extravagant, thus focusing readerly attention on the imaginable possibility of her past future self. And we must know that the possibilities of Hopkinson's creative choices are not merely illusory. As Walter Mosley states, there are few concepts or inventions of the 20th century, from submarine to newspeak, that were not first fictional flights of fancy. We make up, then make real. Thus, Midnight Robber, as science fiction, offers readers critical tools that we make more complex selves from myriad realities. Thank you.
Thank you. Sheldon? Is Sheldon there? So we have some time for questions and answers. I think we have none. We have no questions from the audience. Would the audience please put your questions in Q&A? Well, to start, I think I'd like to ask a question of my own. Rhonda, do you want to say a little more about the figure of Midnight Robber? What it means in that novel, where it comes from?
Sure. So Trinidad Carnival, a traditional Trinidad Carnival figure who tends to be male, and he's dressed in black. He has a big broad hat. He carries guns. It's sort of in a kind of Western kind of mode. And when he accosts carnival participants, he tells them his story of his life, how he becomes to be. And if he does it well, they give him money or carnival loot. And he is known for his speeches then, right? So Midnight Robber speeches are conceived by the people who play masked as Midnight Robber as a kind of heritage that they receive from the past and that leads them into the future. So Tantan, in trying to right the wrongs that she felt that she, after her abuse from her father, she goes into different towns and performs as Midnight Robber. And it's sort of, I think the novel makes it read sort of as a, oh, I just lost it. Robin Hood figure, where she goes and saves people who need saving and gives to people who need things. But it's her storytelling that I focus on in the novel, because she tells the story of how she ends up where she is, right? After she her father is murdered after he rapes her. And this is a story that the whole town witnesses, but definitely her stepmother, Janice, who's trying to make her pay for the death of her father.
Thank you.
I was cut off for a second, but I'm back to do the Q&A. I see we have one question in the Q&A, and I encourage the audience to send us more. The first question is from Ellie Walters. Thank you to all three speakers for such rich and insightful presentations. I have a question for Tadiwa about shady and shadowy subjectivities. I was wondering whether there are any parallels in Jacaranda journals between shade as insult and shade as a phenomenon in nature, and or whether queer conceptualizations of shade tend to tie into environments and ecologies.
Thanks, Ellie, for that question. And I mean, a recurring question that actually appears through different stories in Jacaranda journals is she keeps asking, is a Jacaranda exotic or indigenous? And part of it is she's just mocking Mugabe, because the rhetoric was homosexuality is unnatural or it's not indigenous. And for most people who've been to post-colonial cities, like Jacaranda trees are everywhere. They're usually not indigenous. So it's one of those, they're not indigenous, but there's so much the kind of aesthetic personality of the cities that it's part of the question is to say, well, like at this point, what aesthetics or what politics are indigenous? So that's kind of why there's always this refrain. And for me, what's interesting about the fact that she was at the book fair itself is also the book fair happens in Harare Gardens. So the space itself is kind of this, obviously these public parks are like colonially created public parks. So there is a critique about that kind of like colonial nature history, but she's trying to play with a lot of, or she's trying to incorporate as much of the literal landscape around her in relation to playing with Mugabe's rhetoric around homosexuality. So there is kind of these parallel discourses in terms of like the imagery and the literal place where these debates are happening. as well as the kind of meta discourse around sexuality and whether it's like whether certain orientations are natural or not. Yeah, so that's.
Okay, thank you, Tadiwa. Rhonda, do you have a question? Go ahead.
Hi, I have a question for Jennifer. I really enjoyed the way you talked about memory in Evaristo's work. And I guess if you could share it with us again, because I want to be clear. So are you arguing that Evaristo is challenging, I guess, a linear narrative and using memory and it's sort of the chaos, I guess, of it to to derail traditional ways of telling stories or understanding history? You're muted, yeah.
Yeah, in short, yeah, I would say that it's not so messy in her work. I mean, in a sense, she draws on particular known histories, like those written by Peter Fryer and Halsuga about the Black British presence in Britain that goes really quite far back. And she wants to talk about a lot about how those memories, loosely speaking, are eclipsed or hidden, especially right now with nationalist kind of rhetoric that says, you know, Britain is only for a certain kind of people. And so she's poking fun at the idea that Britishness and, I mean, because she's always funny, Britishness and whiteness are the only definition of each other, which is patently absurd. And so she pokes fun at that through drawing forward a lot of history that just is not talked about. But instead of positing it as history, she posits it as quite alive in the lives of characters, as of course it is alive in the life of characters when their history is eclipsed and hidden. And so in that sense, it becomes part of their identity, perhaps best known through community relations, or through other forms of relations and shared stories. And so while she never uses the word post-memory, I think what happens is that history works in the way that Marion Hirsch is talking about, as these kind of post-memories that circulate amongst Black British individuals and allow for them to sense and learn about their own the potential for their own subjectivities and for their history. And I think in this she's quite brilliant. Yeah, yeah.
I think there are interesting connections here between temporality and space across the three presentations. Focus on futurity, a focus on post-memory, focus on things that haunt, even shade as something that haunts. The next question is from someone who is also focused on temporality. And the question is, it's about temporality across the texts discussed. And the question is, can forms of temporal disjunction and experimentation in these works meaningfully challenge hegemonic structures, or do the aesthetics and political remain separate?
Wow.
Yes, can the aesthetical impact the political? Rhonda.
Hi. I think absolutely, because what my relationship to popular fiction is starts with that that Walter Mosley quotation, right? We make up, then make real. So I do believe that if we are start from the position of imagining differently, then we can behave from that position, right? And not necessarily this kind of reactionary position, etc. And there's a moment in Midnight Robber where Tantan and her father Antonio are going through a dimension veil between Tucson, the planet of Tucson, and into New Halfway Tree. And in that space, they are experiencing, I guess, evolution in reverse and in circular fashion. So Tantan feels like her body is turning into something that's more like a possum or a manitou, and her father is turning into a weasel, and then she keeps feeling a tail, and then she doesn't feel a tail. So that we then have to think about well, I guess in an eco-critical kind of way, our human relationship to the natural world, right? If we are, in fact, as Tantan suggests, or as Hopkinson suggests, part of us, or it's also part of the animal world, we have to really imagine ourselves as not higher than, but in relation to, and sort of have a communal kind of way to think about how we live or are in the world. So I do believe that if we can imagine a different way of being in the world, we can then start working towards what we imagine.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
Do you want to respond, Jennifer? Yes.
Yeah. I was thinking about it while I was listening to you, Rhonda. And I was thinking a lot about Helen Oyeyemi. Do you read her work? Yeah. So I would say that that's a difficult thing to speak to, the political, whether fiction can really serve a political function. But I was thinking about Evaristo. I interviewed her maybe half a dozen years ago, had a wonderful chat with her, and she talked to me a lot about her career. And there was a lot of grunt work, a lot of self-promotion, a lot of going around and reading, and she was not getting a great deal of recognition. And she wrote about this, even though her books were well reviewed. And then along came Girl, Woman, Other, and along came the Booker Prize, and along came a huge readership. And I suppose in an unexpected way, her fiction and her poetry has had a political import in terms of, at least in terms of her readership, which has expanded greatly, and now she's everywhere. And I think that speaks to the potential. It's hard to measure, of course, such potential, but we continue to believe in it as literary scholars, because I think what Rhonda said is really right on. If we can imagine it, then we can make it into a reality. And I really like that configuration of the idea. Yeah. I hope that answers the question a bit.
I think it does. That is an excellent answer. We have just about 2 minutes, so perhaps just one more question. The final question is for Tadiwa. In your work, do you connect shade to other theories, such as the veil or masking? If so, can you elaborate on how shade complements, advances, or conflicts with other theories?
Thanks for that question. I'm definitely gonna, my committee would love that question. In my dissertation, I actually think a lot more about spectacle, more so than veil and masking per se, partly because it's a combination of looking at what the queer community was doing at the book fair, and they were technically I guess not allowed to appear as representatives of the Gay and Lesbian Association. So they were doing interesting aesthetic kind of performance art things there. But then I think about writers as people who are then forced to be mediators of this conversation because the book fair is their space. And Melissa Myambo's chapter is a bit different, and another writer called Philip Joao, because they're not really canonical writers. But the other writers that I look at, it's a lot of spectacle because they came with a lot of bravado to talk about these topics. So I think a lot more about kind of spectacle and shade, or pageantry and shade, but I'm definitely going to think a little bit more deeply about the veil and masking, especially because I definitely see myself in Black studies, and I feel like those are very important themes to kind of work through.
Okay, so I think there are definite connections across these three panels, as I said, in terms of temporality and space, futurity, post-memory, the past, being in the shadows. To sort of wrap this up, part of what literature can do, I think, is bring us into these new spaces and make us rethink our relationship to the past and to the future. So I think that's what we see in these particular presentations. We are at the end of our time, and Pelagia, will you take us out?
You're muted, Pelagia, you're muted.
It has been a pleasure to listen to the presentations today. Thank you very much for coming. And for our fourth and final workshop, we hope to see all of you there. Thank you.
Goodbye. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.